Welcome everybody to the 2011 Coase Lecture. 2012 Coase Lecture. I got my, I just had to send back all my checks last month because I wrote 2011. The lecture was founded in 1992 in honor of Nobel laureate Clifton R. Musser, Professor Emeritus of Law, Ronald Coase, and supported by a grant from the John M. Olin Foundation to the Law and Economics program at the University of Chicago Law School. As many of you know from either your research, from reading, from your classes, or just from being alive in the United States, Ronald Coase is a legendary scholar whose work was fundamental in creating the discipline of law and economics that was really created here in this law school. And I use the word is rather than was, because at the age of 101 years old, Ronald is in the final process of editing a new book. The new book, yes, we should all hope to, at 30 years younger than him, be doing that. Ronald is in the final process of editing this book, which is called When China Became Capitalist. And we're hoping, apparently he's having all sorts of arguments with his editor, and we're hoping that once this book is ready to come out, it's going to be published by Palgrave, we will have him here, and we'll have an event to celebrate the book, celebrate Ronald's contributions to the law school and to our discipline, law. The Coase Lecture is intended to introduce law students, particularly 1L law students, but not exclusively, to the principles of law and economics and using economics to analyze the discipline of law. It's traditionally given by a younger member of the faculty, and Todd, you still qualify as a younger member of the faculty.
Despite my hair.
Despite your hair. I was thinking of saying that, but I'm glad you said it first. And I want to tell you a little bit about Todd Henderson. So Todd Henderson has one of the most interesting biographies that you're going to find for a faculty member at a great law school. Todd received an engineering degree, okay, already somewhat unusual, an engineering degree from Princeton University in 1993. He worked for several years designing and building dams in California before coming to this law school. And while at the law school, Todd was an editor of the Law Review and captained the law school's all-university champion intramural football team. So he was champion. Did we win more? We won?
We won the entire university championship. First time ever.
So, which proves in a slow race even, we don't say anything. But in any event, Todd graduated magna cum laude in 1998 and was elected Order of the Coy. Following law school, Todd clerked for the Honorable Dennis Jacobs of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He then practiced appellate litigation at Kirkland & Ellis in Washington, D.C., and then was an engagement manager, I'm not sure what that means, at McKinsey & Company in Boston. Perhaps you can explain that to us. But in any event, I can think of no one who is better qualified to teach us about law and economics and to give a paper. I'm going to read from your title, Pay for Performance Puzzles, Private and Public. So with that, Todd Henderson.
Thanks, Mike. My fellow Chicagoans, the state of the Coase theorem is strong. Just a joke about the State of the Union tonight. Let me start with a confession. I'm not paid for performance. Whether you learn something, leave confused, or fall asleep in this lecture, I get the same paycheck on February 1st. Think about that for a second. Nothing I do here today has any impact on my compensation for my work. In light of this, if you'd like to leave now, I won't be offended. I believe in transparency, and your attendance here should be informed by the reality that the incentives for good performance are weak. When Dean Schill honored me with an invitation to deliver this lecture, I have to say that was my first thought, and it's the puzzle I want to talk about for the next hour or so. Why are some people paid for performance and not other words? In other words, why doesn't the law school want me to give a good Coase lecture? I have two conflicting goals with this talk. For those of you who think pay for performance is a straightforward and positive thing, I want to tell you that I think the case is a little bit more uneasy than it may seem at first appearance. And for those of you who think pay for performance is rightly confined to CEOs, or maybe they shouldn't even be paid for performance, let alone for teachers, doctors, judges, or a number of other cases I'll mention, I hope to convince you the case is more desirable than it may seem. But before we try to make some progress on describing where and when pay performance might make sense, let me define what I mean by that. Everyone in a capitalist economy is paid for performance either directly or indirectly. Every burger flipper hopes to someday be promoted to the shake machine. But this isn't exactly what I mean. Instead, pay for performance, I mean wage schedules that are directly and immediately linked with objective metrics that are set forth ex ante. So there are sort of three categories of workers. Low-powered incentives are cases in which employees are paid a fixed wage, there's no real bonus tied to performance, where promotions are only sort of tenuously linked with objective performance criteria, and reputational constraints are pretty weak. Most low-wage workers are in this category. So too are public school teachers in the United States, doctors in the United Kingdom at least prior to the mid-2000s, and most government bureaucrats. Medium-powered incentives are cases in which employees are paid a fixed salary, but one that is tied somewhat to performance and where promotions and reputations have a closer connection with how well you do. CEOs prior to about 1985 were in this category, since the typical CEO received a fixed salary and a cash bonus based on the board's ex-post assessment of how well the CEO did. High-powered incentives are cases in which employers pre-commit to certain types of pays based on explicit metrics. A salesperson who earns a 5% commission based on all sales is paid for performance, and so is a CEO who gets stock at the beginning of the year. So where do I fit in? Well, a law professor who does well by some unenumerated metrics and earns an endowed chair or a slightly higher salary than his peers is not paid for performance by my definition. At best, I might be in the medium bucket. I have some idea of what good and bad performance might be, but the linkage between these guesses and my pay is probably pretty weak. In addition, there may be variables that impact my actual compensation that diverge between performance and pay. Politics may intervene. Biases such as race, class, or gender may as well. For instance, in a recent lawsuit, it was revealed that 49 of 50 members of the Iowa law faculty were registered members of a single political party. Does anyone doubt potential for mismatch between performance and pay for the odd person out? Even the perception of bias is problematic, since it can distort incentives for those who may think they are subject to it. So too may budgets. Promises to pay are different from commitments to pay, and this is what defines pay for performance. Courts consider sales commissions earned at the time of sale, and therefore they must be paid. A promised bonus, on the other hand, is an executory contract that need not survive a bankruptcy. One might just say law professor pay doesn't matter much, and law professors are an odd and specialized lot from which to draw any conclusions. But law professors are not alone in being not paid for performance. Most workers are not paid for performance, but almost all of them can be fired. Employment at will, as we have here, is sort of a lumpy pay for performance. When agents can be monitored at low cost and disciplined for bad performance, the case for performance pay, as I've defined it, is much weaker. But I'm different than the average employee. I have tenure, which means I can't be fired for practically any reason. This is what economists call a moral hazard problem. Since I can't be fired and my pay is largely delinked from my performance, I have strong, very strong incentive to shirk. Tenure may be necessary to ensure the integrity of the academic inquiry, although I have serious doubts about that, but it has significant costs. I work hard, in my own opinion, but not nearly as hard as I would if 50% of my pay were at risk. It is true that more work, especially for me, might not result in much improved quality, and that work efficiency bears on the costs and benefits of incentive pay. But unless this is true across the board, that is, incentives are perfectly set now, adding some pay for performance might result in better performance. I'm not alone in having a secure job that bears slack risk. Public school teachers, bank examiners, FDA scientists are all examples of people with jobs from which it's extremely hard to be fired and over which the ability to monitor good or bad performance is extremely difficult, given the difficulty of the tasks, the information asymmetries, and the cost of remedying them. Yet none of these people are paid for performance. If not for money, why am I here, trying the best I can? In other words, what do we think is serving the incentive role in my case? There's several possible things. For one, the quality of today's lecture might influence my reputation among faculty, students, alumni, and friends who are generously here today. Where reputation's powerful, there's less need for other incentives like money. Reputation, even fear, might not be enough for most people. Reputation on top of my existing financial incentives for me might be enough, given the diminishing marginal utility of money and the nature of my profession, but the link between this talk and my reputation is unknown to me, and therefore when deciding how much work to put in, trading work off against leisure, error cost may be high. This doesn't necessarily mean less effort, since the error cost could run the other way, but there's reason to think the bias is systematic in the underperforming direction. There are many inputs to reputation, and if people have relatively high discount rates, they may overemphasize the near-term value of leisure over the longer-term and highly uncertain impact of good performance on reputation. To be sure, there is likely heterogeneity in the population on this dimension, which simply means for some, reputation will be enough on the margin, but there's reason to believe for many it will not be. In any event, the link between reputation and pay is probably slight in my case, so if that's what we're relying on, the incentive might be weak. Another motivation is monitoring by my superiors. The dean asked me to be here, and if I was his no-show, I might not be in his good graces. He's listening here, and maybe he's monitoring in some way. He might encourage or permit shaming by faculty or students if I didn't take this seriously. In tight societies, shaming might be enough. It doesn't necessarily work in other contexts as well. David Larker and co-authors recently showed trying to shame allegedly overpaid CEOs by lampooning their pay in the media had little or no impact on future compensation. But what the dean would do or allow, and thus what exactly bad performance would mean, I don't know. I assume it's non-zero, but it's probably not worth thinking about. I also have some intrinsic motivation. Some people, we could call them artisans, have a preference to do well, even when they're fairly certain no one will find out or care. Steve Jobs allegedly perfected the inside of Apple computers, even though they couldn't be opened. The cynic in me suspects an instrumental motivation in this case. The unobservable perfection was a story that could be told to others to motivate them to do observable perfection, or maybe leaked outside of Apple, after all, I know the story, to build a brand with customers with preferences for things built by artisans. But I have no doubt some people labor under this burden, even if they don't know exactly how or why. Presumably, I've been selected and screened based on an assessment of my intrinsic motivation, but once the tenure process is ended, my preferences may adjust, perhaps dramatically. There are also in-kind benefits that might flow from doing a good job. Typical employers use Employee of the Month awards or nicer offices, prizes, other carrots to induce good performance. Best I can tell, we don't do much of this, but many places do. So are these enough? A little bit of reputation, a little bit of fear of shaming, some carrots on the side. There's some evidence on point in both academy and more generally. In a 2000 issue of the Journal of Legal Studies, Brian Leiter demonstrated the huge performance gap in law faculties. He looked at a 4-year period of production of books and articles by law professors. Shockingly, the difference between the first and the 40th school was over 10 times as much production. At the top school, take a guess, that's us, the average faculty member had 6.5 books or articles in 4 years, or about 1.5 a year. The second best, Yale, had half as much. The 40th, Washington and Lee, 0.7 articles or books over 4 years per faculty member. For the mathematically challenged in the audience, this is 1 article or book per professor every 6 years. This is virtually no work. To be sure, there's more to being a law professor than writing scholarship, but scholarship's the biggest and most time-consuming part. As for the other part, teaching, the marginal cost of production is lower than for scholarship. I don't mean to demean the importance of teaching. It's crucial, vital, and hard, but it takes less time than scholarship, especially over time. The average law professor at the schools in the Leiter study teaches about 4 hours a week, and unlike Chicago, most of these professors teach the same material year after year. It also strains credulity to think that teaching quality is inversely proportional to the rankings. No one thinks the quality of teaching is much higher, 10 times higher at Washington and Lee than it is at Yale. One might argue that we should be focusing on quality of scholarship, not quantity. Ronald Coase, who lists lecture series honors, has almost 40,000 Google Scholar citations from 2 articles, The Nature of the Firm and the Problem of Social Cost. I have about 150 Google Scholar citations from over 20 articles, QED. But Leiter's work also shows the total number of citations, our best measure of influence, and citations per work are correlated with productivity, not the inverse. In other words, the most productive scholars are the ones who are the most influential, not the other way around, notwithstanding my personal example. At the very least, it's hard to imagine law professors performing at their maximum. Few dispute tenure dampens incentives. There seem to be incentive problems in other areas too. Most workers who work for someone else today fall into the low or medium-powered incentive bucket. Reputational forces or intrinsic motivation may be a powerful force for many of these, but no one can seriously doubt there's a large amount of slack in the labor force. There's little doubt the sum total of costs from employee slack for the 92,000 employees of Microsoft or the 287,000 employees of GE are greater than the excessive compensation paid to Steve Ballmer or Jeff Immelt. And yet academics and the press focus almost entirely on the latter. I'll come back to this puzzle in a moment. For now, a bit of evidence about this amount of slack, particularly here in government work. In general, government workers are much more secure in their jobs, and the use of performance pay is very rare. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, between 2001 and 2009, the public sector layoff and discharge rate was about 1/3 of the private sector rate. Recent data shows that among non-first-year employees, the discharge rate for civil servants in the federal government is indistinguishable from zero. In addition, although some government agencies recently started using some bonuses, they have much weaker incentives than the private sector. Government workers therefore have weaker incentives to perform. This is borne out in the data. Again, the BLS National Compensation Survey shows private sector employees worked an average of 2,050 hours in 2008, about 15% more than the hours worked by the average public sector employees in similar jobs. And as a footnote, the pay of government workers at the same time was 35% higher, 69% higher if you include benefits. So why do we pay some people performance and not others? Let's look at some of the costs and benefits in the way an economist might. I'm not an economist, so this is probably not the exact way an economist would do it, but a lawyer and pretending to be an economist. The chief benefit of trying reward or performance, whether it's pay or other reward, is we should expect better performance when more is gained from doing well. All individuals maximize their utility, and if the payer does not try to shape or influence the utility curve of the payee, then it will simply take whatever the payee's curve is, leaving it to the individual to maximize whatever it is they value most highly. This might be aligned with the desired output, but why leave it to chance? Surely employees, be they law professors or lawyers or engineers, have heterogeneous levels of basic work ethic, and it would make sense for employees to try to alter that in a positive way. Lots of people use different metrics, as I've said, but money is probably the most common one, so it's important to look briefly at why money is the most useful means of pay for performance. The most obvious reason is the valuation of money is simple and universal. Putting aside the diminishing marginal utility of money, money has the same value to everyone. $500 is worth $500, and everyone knows what an extra $500 means. In contrast, employees may have wider variations in how they value reputational gains or in-kind benefits. How much would a nicer office or a pat on the back mean to you? And even if it means a lot, a good reputation that isn't conveyed into money can't pay for groceries or the heating bill. Thus, it might be sensible for an employee to err on the side of money, all else being equal. When I worked as a consultant before coming to the law school, my German colleagues were paid with cash and BMWs, while the American employees were just paid with cash. I assume this was due to some peculiar features of the German tax code, but it's true that every German employee would be preferred to pay all in cash, since cash allows you to buy a BMW as well as everything else. Money is also scalable with performance and conveys information effectively in both directions. Compare a stock option with an ex-post bonus for a CEO. If the CEO is told she'll get a bonus based on performance at the end of the year, she has a greater incentive to work for performance than if she were just paid cash up front. But if the CEO is given stock option that rises or falls in a continuous as opposed to sort of a discrete or uncertain quanta, this gives not only the possibility of reward for small increments, but also generates precise feedback loops. The CEO would learn with experience that doing X generates Y gains in value, while doing A generates B, and so forth. Although possible in any pay system, it's likely more direct and fine-grained in pay performance, and therefore reduces the cost of both learning for both the payor and payee. A third benefit is the direct alignment of interest when the person writing the performance contract is interested either directly or indirectly in money. A chief benefit of paying managers with stock options is that shareholders hold stock as well, and therefore the interests of the principal and the agent are aligned. A dollar gain for one is a dollar gain for the other. Monitoring costs are lower, and there's a psychological benefit from being on the same team. This might be quite important in generating efficient team production. About 95% of stock options are used at levels below the executive level, and for people who can't possibly think they have any direct impact flowing from their performance to the stock price. This is puzzling, but when one considers the alignment of interests for pay for performance have in generating teamwork, the puzzle seems less beguiling. There are likely many more, but let me just mention one more that I think is important. Pay for performance is more symmetrical than other forms of compensation I've alluded to. Stock, for example, rises and falls in a way that is usually beyond the reach of the pay setter, and this means that there's a built-in check on the tendency for a heads I win, tails you lose scenario. Cash or in-kind benefits can be harder to take away, both because it's gone, or maybe because it's gone, or because the law makes it more difficult. Clawback provisions are notoriously underutilized and difficult to employ, and the firm attempts to work private solutions to this have often been frustrated. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, for instance, banned corporate loans to executives, even when designed to prevent cheating, by bonding executives to firms through a forgiveness promise tied to a later determination of good conduct. More generally, ex-ante metrics will reflect a firm pre-commitment the future will look a certain way, which not only provides certainty to the employee, but is also a nice way of preventing ex-post renegotiation on terms favorable to the employee. It also puts money on the line for bad performance in a significant way. In a recent case, Bear Stearns' CEO, Jimmy Kane, sold his ownership in his bank, estimated at $1 billion in 2007, for $61 million in 2008. The final story of the financial crisis has yet to be written. We're still learning stuff about the Great Depression 80 years later, but the best data we have suggests whatever its shortcomings, the pay-for-performance incentives worked as intended along this dimension. CEOs who made bad decisions lost billions. There's also a compelling logic to pay-for-performance, but there are obvious problems too. If there weren't, we would have seen it used long before the 1990s in corporate America, and we would see it used widely elsewhere. I know only one law school that uses something remotely like a pay-for-performance system. George Mason pays a relatively low salary but a cash bonus for each article published in a top 10 law journal. If the case for pay-for-performance were as straightforward as it seems, Mason would not be the only one, and their pay approach would be much more sophisticated and high-powered. So what are some of the downsides? Well, here's an incomplete list. First, there's what Frederick Hayek might call the knowledge problem. For pay-for-performance to be effective, the employer must be able to identify ex ante what the employee should be optimizing, and then translate this into pay design that mimics the production function. In some cases, this is easy. On Georgia peach farms, labor, mostly migrant labor, is paid according to the number of non-bruised bushels of peaches picked. But in a service economy where tasks can't be measured by the bushel, this is more complex. How would you measure the quality of a good teacher? The first step would be for administrators to identify what makes a good teacher, and this I think is more difficult than it might seem. We might have a sense of who good teachers are and bad ones, but be harder to identify what exactly they were doing that made it so. Even assuming we did know, we'd have to translate it into a set of objective metrics we could write up to try to influence effort towards the optimal amount and direction. Should school administrators pay teachers for inputs to student achievement, for example, the amount of material covered or number of hours in the classroom, or for outputs, for example, test scores or graduation rates or maybe even future income? Even if they could agree on which approach to follow, which is the best of these metrics? If teachers are paid on test scores, the result may be to simply pay teachers in rich neighborhoods more than in poor ones, since test scores are, for a variety of reasons, likely higher there to begin with. We should want pay tied to marginal contribution, not absolute level. So it might make sense to pay based on the difference the teacher makes. We could test students before the beginning of the school year and then at the end on a particular subject and reward teachers according to the difference. This adds some administrative costs as well as some potentially perverse incentives. But if the pay setter has all the relevant information about the production function and can relay this perfectly to an employee, then the use of high-powered incentives is fairly compelling. But we have reason to doubt that they have all the information. As Hayek points out, in a complicated system, it might be characterized by lots of tacit knowledge residing in dispersed individuals. If this is true, that is, if employees combined have better information than employers about how well a job should be done, the ex post bonus system might be preferable. Take me again. Since I don't know the metrics on performance on which I'm being evaluated in my yearly review, assuming I had one, I'll just do my best along all dimensions according to my best estimate of the optimal performance. An ex post system allows my employer to harness that information conveyed from all of the employees to the decision maker. My explicit or tacit knowledge reveals my own choices. For a complicated task, we might then just declare defeat at this point about pay for performance. The Exante Identification problem has led some serious thinkers to do just that. Bruno Frey and Margaret Osterloh conclude, quote, "It's practically impossible to determine tasks that are to be fulfilled in the future precisely enough so that variable pay for performance can be applied. In other words, the job of a teacher or computer programmer or architect or doctor is simply too complicated to be reduced to an algorithm." While true, I think this argument proves too much. Modern day business corporations are enormously complex, and CEOs are continuously optimizing along numerous dimensions, trying to please customers, investors, lenders, suppliers, workers, citizens, and so on. And yet the stock price has proven a very useful, although not perfect, metric shareholders can use as an incentive to induce hard work and good performance from managers. The share price is simple, highly salient, and well correlated with the interest of the principal. And after all, the question is not whether ex-ante metrics perfectly track the desired outcome, but whether, recognizing no scheme will be perfect, the benefits of the particular incentives exceed their costs. A second and related problem with pay for performance is the effort substitution problem identified by economists Holmstrom and Milgram. They showed how if there are incentivized and non-incentivized tasks in some work environment, workers will divert resources from the non-incentivized to the incentivized. If unintended, this could result in worse performance from the perspective of the pay setter. Consider education again. If teachers are paid based on test scores, they'll devote resources to improving test scores. Not a surprise. This could be okay if the tests are a good measure of the desired output from teaching. In the case of multiplication tables, this might be right, but in something like history or English, the whole point might be higher learning, and this might be only loosely correlated with doing well on a test. Here at the law school, you'll learn almost nothing that is on the bar exam. Yet we're confident you'll leave as good lawyers, and importantly, we also believe that we as professors contributed to this by teaching you something, a new way of thinking about problems. But how do you capture that? Many will think the measure of a law professor is publication. If paid for publications, I'll publish a lot. Sacrificing quality, maybe that's true. If paid by citation, I would have incentives to optimize the quality versus quantity trade-off, but I might underdeliver other valuable things like being a good colleague or teaching or supervising papers or speaking. In other words, if you make a mistake in choosing X when you should have chosen Y or Z to incentivize, the person will maximize X, even if they know, importantly, that Y or Z would have been the better thing to do. A third problem with pay for performance is cheating. It may be easier and more effective and more dangerous. If employees are given an algorithm that they can use to calculate their pay based on how future uncertainties resolve, they may spend time and energy figuring out how to beat the game rather than playing it effectively. This is akin to the problem with rating agencies during the financial crisis, revealing information, the formula for obtaining a AAA rating. Rating agencies revealed the information explicitly because of financial incentives to get business, and implicitly because of the revolving door between banks and rating agencies. Given this information, banks devoted enormous resources to figuring out how to work the algorithm to their advantage instead of being tested by it. There are several losses that may result. Most obviously, effort will be directed inefficiently at the same wage if cheating is greater, since employees can earn the same pay for less effort. The end result could be less desired output at greater cost, given the deadweight losses from the work to figure out how to game the algorithm. Going back to the example of teachers, teaching to the test is a form of cheating. A more perverse version is giving the students the answers. We're all familiar with the work Steve Levitt has done on cheating in the public schools in Chicago, and the recent scandals in Atlanta are an example of this too. Another example of an inefficiency comes from doctors in the UK, where one of the pay for performance recently introduced was a target waiting time at emergency rooms. Pay for doctors was reduced if patients in emergency rooms took longer to be treated than 4 hours. What would you do if you were a doctor and you were told this was a pay metric? Well, you could speed up treatment, but there might be reasons why this is difficult, ranging from the clinical needs of the patients to lack of resources and labor rules. You could lobby the National Health Service to hire more doctors, but even if they agreed, the gains would come too late and not locally enough to make your time and investment worth it. You could treat without regard to need, but only based on speed, but this would be a serious breach of your ethical duties. So what would you do? What we know you would do is find the easiest way to beat the 4-hour rule. What did doctors do? They refused to take patients in the emergency room until the emergency room had cleared enough, making the 4-hour time likely. So ambulances queued up outside of emergency rooms waiting to deliver patients to satisfy this rule. You might think, as a doctor, this is perfectly consistent with your ethical norms because patients in ambulances will be fine, relatively safe in that environment. A government audit said that's not the case. A few hundred patients died as a result. The bigger problem, however, is what French economist Frédéric Bastiat called the seen and unseen problem. People tend to think about what is right in front of them, the seen, but ignore costs on the unseen. So a bailout to help a failing bank may help reduce the harm to the bank's customers and investors, that is the seen, but it may ignore the moral hazard problem, which leads other banks to take additional risks that hurt their customers. They're the unseen. In the ER case, the unseen were patients who suffered or died as a result of the shortage of the ambulances in the community to bring the sick to the hospital. Even if remedied, this problem would lead to an overinvestment of social resources in ambulances. Another form of cheating arrives when the payee is involved in the pay-setting process. A subtle example of this was demonstrated in a recent paper by my Booth School colleagues Adair Morrison and Metsiru. They showed how powerful CEOs are able to induce boards to shift weight to performance measures that are better performing, thus earning pay that does not necessarily reflect an unbiased view of ex-ante incentives. The possibility might also lead workers to invest in trying to influence the pay-setting process, which could be justified by both sides as trying to capture information employees have, but actually could just be wasteful attempts at manipulation. Of course, these cheating incentives can exist without pay for performance, since any form of evaluation can create an incentive to cheat. Tenured professors have committed plagiarism. Another example involves CEO. Before the pay for performance revolution of the early 1990s, the typical CEO contract, as I said, consisted mostly of a salary and bonus, and it turned out that this was linked primarily to revenues and a number of employees. After all, running a big company is more difficult than running a small one. But if you were a CEO, you had a strong incentive how to figure out how to maximize your own pay and deduce the algorithm, which boards may or may not even have known. As a result of finding the correlation, CEOs did the rational thing. They tried to maximize revenues. As a footnote, no investor cares a whit how big a company is, so this is a strange way to pay from the management from the perspective of a shareholder. The result was the empire building and inefficient conglomerates of the 1970s and early 1980s. This example raises an important point. Every pay scheme has incentives, either explicit or implicit. So the choice isn't between incentives and no incentives, but rather between good ones and bad ones. It's evaluation that leads to cheating, not money. But cheating may be more likely if large amounts of pay are at stake, which is just another way of showing this power of high-powered incentives. Cheating is just the flip side of the power of pay to motivate positive performance. And cheating may be more likely where the reward algorithm is known ex ante. The UK is a good example. The power of incentives would have been weaker in the UK if they just said to the emergency room doctors, speed up, which is the point of the high-powered incentives delivering a higher motivation, be it for good or bad. A fourth potential problem with pay performance is there's likely to be heterogeneity in how well employees understand the production function. Again, consider education. If you pay students based on output, say test scores, but the students or some students don't know how to learn, then the incentive will be ineffective. A recent paper by Roland Fryer provides some support for this. The study paid out nearly $10 million to 27,000 students in about 200 schools in Chicago, Dallas, and New York. Although the data was mixed and not entirely inconsistent with the positive impact from financial incentives, the cases involving paying for inputs for students were weaker than those for outputs. Not only might incentives not work, the result might be perverse. If you pay students to do better, the end result might just be end up giving good students more. This would be true if the response to incentives is correlated with performance in the absence of high-powered incentives. The rich might just get richer in a sense. It could be that improving the test scores or education level of the top students is a net positive investment, but in a world of scarce resources, it might not be the optimal social strategy. Note that this problem, the lack of knowledge about the production function, might not just be true for agents, but for principals. If pay setters don't know what to incentivize, pay for performance is bound to result in worse outcomes. In Colorado, for instance, the current pay for performance scheme involves paying teachers to obtain graduate degrees. There's a problem with this. There's absolutely no evidence that advanced degrees is correlated with better teaching or better student outcomes. In other words, performance in this case was an input, not an output, and paying for inputs makes sense only when there's a link with outputs that is clearly proven. A fifth issue with pay for performance is that financial incentives might undermine, or in the language of economists, crowd out intrinsic motivations or other valuable non-monetary motivations. If academics care about the pursuit of ideas or public servants care about doing good for the public interest, then these might be crowded out if we start paying people. The mix of employees will change, new hires who care more about money will flow in, and these people might flow out, and that mix might be something that's undesirable. You get what you pay for. And there's some strong evidence about widely heterogeneous views about the value and importance of money. In Daniel Kahneman's fascinating new book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, he discusses a large-scale study on how views about money influence earnings later in life. Researchers asked about 12,000 people when they were 17 how important on a 4-point scale being well off would be when they were older. There was an extremely high correlation between desire and fact 2 decades later. Among the nearly 600 doctors in the group, for instance, each additional point on the money importance scale was associated with a yearly change in income of $15,000 by the age of 40. People have different preferences for money, and any scheme that relies on money as a major motivator may undermine other motivations and impact the composition of employees in the field. But if the performance criteria are chosen wisely, this criticism is a bit muted. We might have different academics in a world where pay for performance for academics reigns, but if they're better at delivering whatever it is that academics are supposed to deliver, then why would that be such a bad thing? A final problem is the conditions most suitable to developing a robust pay performance regime may be less robust where the pay performance is most necessary. I'll come back to this in a moment in a specific case, but let me just explain briefly. Let's compare a typical CEO and a government bureaucrat. The CEO is subjected to intense monitoring. Anybody with access to the internet can check instantly the stock price, and the CEO can be pretty easily fired. The average CEO tenure has fallen from nearly 15 years to less than 4 years in the past decade. And the percentage of CEOs leaving involuntarily increased from 1 in 8 in 1995 to 1 in 3 by 2005. In contrast, as noted earlier, the average bureaucrat does a job without any metric of easy evaluation and basically can't be fired. Pay for performance makes much more sense for the bureaucrat. But given the difficulties just discussed, developing a workable and efficient pay system may only be possible in a competitive market with many hundreds of potential innovators testing and failing with new compensation schemes. To paraphrase Holmes's description of the common law, if pay for performance success is about experience, not logic, then we should expect to see it only where there is opportunity for lots of disciplined experience, and this may be precisely where we need it the least. Given the ambiguity of these costs and benefits, the choices of many employers over a long time is the best guess we can make about what works and what doesn't. But this doesn't mean we're at the only equilibrium or that things couldn't be improved. If there are reasons for the choices that are made that have little to do with efficiency, perhaps we could have learning. When answering this question, we need to be sure we don't fall into the nirvana fallacy. That is, we're comparing pay for performance not with the perfect thing, but with the next best opportunity. And we should also be humble. The fact that we don't see pay for performance should tell us something. And we should be careful about overturning compensation systems, especially on the ideas of a law professor. So what does law have to do with this? Why do I have anything to say about this? Well, law matters a lot and can add some things to the debate. In a world of purely private contracting, the answer would be that law doesn't have much to say, other than policing the boundaries of contracts for issues like infancy, incapacity, or unconscionability. But government is inevitably involved in pay decisions, both public and private. Law sets pay where the government provides the services in question. This is true in sectors such as education, healthcare, at least 40% of it funded in the United States directly by government, and in regulation. We might also have reason to doubt the efficiency of the pay-setting process in government. The labor market is not as competitive as in private markets, and the issues that plague bureaucracies, influence peddling, politics, and the like are likely to distort incentives. The most powerful labor unions in the United States are government labor unions, and the ability to innovate may be constrained by their power and the contracts they've written with government employers. In every other sector, the government sets the rules for pay. In Delaware, where most companies are incorporated, law empowers the board of directors to set suitable compensation, quote unquote. And Delaware courts have the power to review CEO pay. This law specifically authorizes the use of stock options. This sounds blasé, but it was not always the case that stock options were legal in the US and elsewhere. They were extremely rare in the US 20 years ago, and just 5 years ago in Germany, stock options were illegal. It is in the area of CEO pay where most of the work has been done, both in terms of pay performance, contract innovation, and an academic analysis, and therefore it's worth a detailed look at what we can learn from it. Despite the fact that pay performance is an issue with many potential applications, academic interest has focused almost entirely on CEO pay, even though the number of CEOs in the country is something like 5,000 people in an economy of over 150 million workers. As of this morning, the Westlaw database contained over 8,000 legal articles about executive compensation. For reference, there were about 5,000 legal articles mentioning mail and wire fraud, about the same number mentioning agency costs, and the same number mentioning the namesake of this lecture, Ronald Coase, the most cited author in law. Why the obsession with executive compensation? It could be because the amounts are large and the attention is thus voyeuristic. But there aren't 8,000 or even 8 articles about the compensation of actors, baseball sluggers, lawyers, doctors, entrepreneurs, or even hedge fund managers. And as Steve Kaplan and Josh Varel have shown, each of these professions has seen a pay increase as dramatically as that seen by corporate chiefs in the last 2 decades. Consider, for instance, that in 2007, the top 25 hedge managers took in $1 billion per person. $25 billion is the total compensation for the CEOs of every single public company in the United States. That's about 5,000. Why might lawyers or legal academics care so much about the pay per corporate chiefs as opposed to Tom Cruise, who makes $25 million a film, or Albert Pujols, who's just signed a $240 million contract with the Angels, or Eric Holder, our Attorney General, who earned $3.3 million as a lawyer at the law firm he worked at before he became the Attorney General. To put this in perspective, Disney shareholders fought and lost a multi-year lawsuit about the pay for their former president, Michael Ovitz. His pay worked out to about $500,000 per day. That's a lot of money to be sure, but it was in part to compensate him for the risk of leaving a successful talent agency to run Disney, a risk that turned out to be real when he failed. And in any event, was less than the amount Kim Kardashian recently earned for simply appearing at a Las Vegas party. There's not only a lot of attention paid to CEO pay, but it's subject to heavy regulation. Firms must make disclosures of pay in gory detail and beyond what the market would plausibly demand. For instance, as a matter of federal law, firms must disclose and itemize all perks paid to corporate executives that exceed $50,000. For the average public company, this is orders of magnitude smaller than a rounding error. The median Fortune 500 company, Jacobs Engineering Group, had expenses last year of $9.7 billion, meaning the SEC believes shareholders care about perks that would amount to 0.00005% of Jacobs' expenses. Even the total amounts of pay are tiny relative to things shareholders could possibly care about. In 2007, the total pay, salary, bonus, options, long-term incentive contracts, all other pay at the largest 1,600 firms was $9 billion. This is a lot, but it was 0.09% of sales, 0.07% of market capitalization, and 1.2% of net income, and about a third of what 25 investors made. Although the amount of absolute pay is higher today than at any time in history, relative to firm value, it is lower than it was during most of the 1930s through the 1960s, and is in line with the historical average over the past 80 years. As one example, if we peg the CEO pay to sales and market value indexed at 1 in 1936, in 2007 they were 0.5 and 0.07 respectively. So why the big focus on CEO pay? The answer to the puzzle, I think, resides in the history of CEO pay. During the period of the Depression to the 1980s, as I said, CEO paid was basically with cash. Importantly, it wasn't the CEOs didn't have incentives to pay, incentives related to pay, they did. The incentives were about non-transparent things like building empires. It wasn't until a 1990 Harvard Business Review article that entitled "It's Not How Much You Pay, But How" that this dawned on investors and managers. Once shareholders started paying CEOs like owners instead of bureaucrats, CEO pay took off. From the mid-1930s until the 1980s, the median value of total compensation earned by CEOs was a fairly consistent at slightly less than $1 million in inflation-adjusted dollars. From the mid-1980s to the 2000s, the median rose to more than $5 million, and today it's something over $10 million. Of course, the reason for this growth over this period is the value of U.S. firms have increased dramatically, and CEO pay has risen right along with them. If you pay CEOs like owners and the owners get rich, the CEOs will get rich. As I mentioned, Steve Kaplan and others have shown the rise is not only for CEOs, but for all sorts of other superstars. One reason is globalization, since individuals can deploy their talents over a larger base of customers. One only need compare the fortunes of Charles Dickens and J.K. Rowling to see the powerful impact of the superstar effect and very low information transmission costs. The answer to the puzzle about why there's so much focus on CEO pay, I think, has to do with bigger picture issues about the relative amount of pay between workers and CEOs and a battle over who controls corporate power. In the 1930s, two of FDR's brain trusts wrote a famous book in which they lamented the passing of the owner-managed firm, describing the problems of dispersed shareholders trusting the fortunes to managers who could steal from them. The so-called separation of ownership and control did not manifest itself in an obvious way until pay per performance was unleashed in the 1990s. This does not mean it did not exist, as I've said, even about pay. It did, but in a less salient way. CEOs shirked, they empire builded, they reaped in-kind benefits, and importantly, CEOs tolerated enormous amounts of slack in their employees. There was no one like Jack Welch until CEOs were paid like for performance. Neutron Jack, as he was known when he was the CEO of General Electric, took pleasure in firing the bottom 10% every year. He wasn't a sadist. He was trying to reduce employee slack in order to make shareholders richer. But it made him richer too, and he was pilloried in the press as a result. Until pay was explicitly linked and disclosed, costs like these were more hidden and therefore more tolerated. The growth in CEO pay also became a political issue as a proxy for the widening wealth gap. Since 1973, a greater share of national productivity has gone to returns on capital and others instead of average workers, and the rise in CEO pay is a very easy and politically salient way to express this. The ratio of the median CEO pay to the average worker was less than 40-1 for the period 1930 to 1985, and by 2005 it was about 120-1. These facts capture a quite politically salient fact, as expressed in the president's recent speech on inequality in Kansas, and the fact that firms now, as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act, must publicly report this ratio, meaningless as it is, as part of their securities disclosures. Two responses come immediately to mind. First, the ratio of the average star to non-star has risen everywhere. As Kaplan has shown, the ratio of Tom Cruise's salary to his makeup artist, or the average cameraman on one of his movies, certainly exceeds the ratio of Jimmy Stewart to his in a way that mirrors the change in CEO pay. Second, the question should be whether or not the growth in the ratio is socially a good or bad thing. Even John Rawls would be okay with a change if it was a necessary precondition for the huge growth of the US economy. Of course, this is an unknowable question. Ultimately, the real question, and the one that we lawyers should care about, is not how much, but who should decide. Shareholders versus boards, companies versus courts, and so on. The pendulum has swung back a bit in the direction of shareholders. A say-on-pay vote is now a non-binding requirement as a matter of federal law, but it's binding in some other countries, and we might be headed there too. And courts. A recent case involving Cincinnati Bell perhaps foreshadows greater court involvement in pay. These criticisms are based undoubtedly on egregious cases where pay was excessive, at least when viewed ex post, but they ignore the ex ante view, where pay may be more sensibly viewed as a fair bargain, and ignore the fact that pay overall bears a close relation with performance. There's good work that shows pay tightly linked with performance, more now than any time in history. Top decile firms in pay outperform their industries by 50%, and bottom decile underperform theirs by 25%. This was a fact not true before the pay for performance revolution. Notwithstanding this data, pay for performance is under attack. In a book-length treatment, law professors Lucian Bebchuk and Jesse Freed described the pay revolution in CEO pay as a failure. Quote, flawed compensation arrangements have been widespread, persistent, and systematic, and they've stemmed from defects in underlying governance structure that enables executives to exercise considerable influence over their board. In other words, in our corporate governance systems, CEOs are the puppet masters, and the boards, who are supposed to be their bosses, are the marionettes. CEOs appoint directors, they exert enormous social and psychological influence over them, and they can reward them with carrots and sticks. In addition, the CEO earns $1 for every dollar paid, whereas the board member, who after all is paying with other people's money, loses nothing, except a very small chance of discipline from unhappy shareholders who themselves have very little to use. This means CEOs have an incentive to spend a lot of time thinking about pay, giving them more information and greater bargaining power. The authors therefore conclude that it's agency costs, that there's something flawed about corporate governance, and this is why pay is as high as it is, and why we should care. They point to a bunch of different types of pay, like non-indexed stock options, as examples of how pay is clearly set in a way that is not in the interest of shareholders. Saul Levmore has offered a persuasive reason why, in the case of non-indexed stock options, what he calls super risk alteration, CEOs would have incentives with indexed options to eschew the first best projects for second best ones that have higher volatility and therefore greater expected value. But I wanted to test the agency cost theory about why pay is the way it is. And so to do that, I looked at a set of data. Economic intuition tells us if it were the case that CEOs were so abusing shareholders, there would be money on the table. That is, money could be made by buying companies and ousting domineering CEOs and improving management. Although the amount of excessive pay might be small, insufficient to justify the expense of a takeover, Surely a self-aggrandizing CEO would be costly to shareholders along other dimensions as well, and getting a good CEO would be a game worth the candle. But instead of relying on economic intuition, I wanted to test this with data. I looked at 100 companies who were in restructuring and bankruptcy. First, I showed, following from work by Douglas Baird, how agency costs are dramatically reduced for these firms. The dispersed shareholders are removed, the CEO is removed, the CEO contract is ripped up and a new one is written, and very powerful investors take over the firms. They're replaced, shareholders are replaced by a sort of single or small group of super sophisticated investors looking to turn around the firm. What I found in this environment of greatly reduced agency costs were contracts that looked identical to ones where agency costs were higher. This doesn't necessarily prove that there are no agency costs or that there are not contracts that cannot be improved, but it casts some serious doubt on a completely managerial power view of the corporation. Bebchuk and Fried also pointed to the fact that CEOs earn large returns from trading on inside information as evidence of managerial power. They write, quote, insider trading profits provide extra value to executives that does not show up in any of the firm's accounting information or compensation figures disclosed to shareholders. Thus, the cost of these hidden insider trading profits to shareholders is likely to go unnoticed. And they conclude insider trading profits are difficult to explain from an optimal contracting perspective, but easily explained under the managerial power approach. Here we have, again, a debate about the economic theory of pay. We have, on one hand, a claim CEOs can earn secret profits based on abusing their position, and on the other hand, an economic intuition that there is no such thing as a free lunch, assuming people know that insiders trade on information, which we do. In well-functioning labor markets, boards trying to meet the reservation wage of CEOs should take these profits into account. Again, this is a question that we should resolve in a good Chicago way with data. In other work, I was able to estimate the total amount of expected insider trading that CEOs would earn using a specific SEC rule that was promulgated, actually, ironically, to try to reduce insider trading. I was then able to sort CEOs into different categories of propensity to trade on inside information based on their disclosed use of the new rule, trades under the new rule. I could then compare CEOs who used the rule with those that did not, estimating how their other compensation changed or did not change relative to a group of similarly situated firms. I examined the change in pay in the period before they were using the rule to the period after and compared this with the changes in the CEOs who did not use the rule. For the group who didn't use the rule and therefore would not be expected to earn any insider trading profits, the change in pay was highly predicted by traditional pay models, which use inputs like the change in market value and profits generated as predictors of changes in pay. For the group who did use the rule and therefore expected to earn more insider trading profits, pay did not rise as much as the models predicted. In other words, CEOs who expected to earn profits trading were paid less than they would have been paid otherwise. This suggests boards are not completely beholden to CEOs and that the market for CEO pay functions fairly well. It would be wrong to conclude pay for performance in the corporate America is perfect for all the reasons, or that all reforms are misguided, but I think it would also be wrong to conclude that this is a failure that should be jettisoned, as Fry suggested. In fact, I think the evidence is strong enough to suggest an expansion into other areas, and that's what I want to talk about. An example of other areas are a bank examiner, something I mentioned earlier. When looking at the financial crisis, going back to Bebchuk, again, he points the finger at CEOs. He argued that the bank CEO pay was a significant contributing factor to the financial crisis and suggested a proposed, more efficient way to pay them. The story goes like this. Bank CEOs were paid with shares of bank stock, just like other CEOs. But unlike the CEO of a non-bank, if a bank goes belly up, the government, as the lender of last resort, may step in and bail out the bank's creditors, namely depositors who were covered by FDIC insurance, or bondholders who the government bailed out in numerous firms in 2008 and 2009. Given this explicit or implicit limitation on the downside for bank creditors, they will take less care about which banks they invest in and will not monitor bank risk, taking as much as they would if they stood to lose more. As such, bank CEOs will take the risk shareholders will prefer, and since share value is greater, the greater the risk, the amount of risk-taking may be socially suboptimal. Bebchuk proposes that bank CEOs be required to be paid with debt, since that way they would bear some of the downside of risk-taking. This idea has great appeal. Paying CEOs with the entire capital structure of the firm forces CEOs to reconcile the tension in the choices of debt and equity. In most firms, debt holders force this reconciliation by contracting to limit the range of CEO decisions. This is, again, something my colleague Douglas Baird has shown. But bank bailouts make this less likely. There's reason to doubt, however, the ability of the government to influence bank CEO pay in a positive fashion. Bank CEOs can easily unwind and unvoid a requirement to hold debt by contracting with third parties to unwind their debt incentives. A put option on the CEO's debt holdings would effectively enable the CEO to transfer the debt risk to an option writer. As long as the monitoring and enforcement of bank CEOs' portfolio requirements are imperfect, the optimal compensation contract will be elusive. Shareholders, too, can unwind incentives that direct CEO choices away from what might be desirable. For instance, if bank CEOs are required to hold a certain amount of debt, shareholders can pay them with more cash or more equity. More simply, shareholders could just alter the basis for hiring and firing decisions to reflect the risk that they want and that they would prefer, and therefore unwind any incentives that might show up in the compensation tables. These observations led Fred Tung and I to propose paying bank regulators with high-powered incentives as a way of better aligning incentives with a socially desired outcome. That is, don't worry so much about the choices CEOs make, let's pay the policeman differently. We were not the first to have this general idea. In good Chicago spirit, this was a Chicago idea. In 1974, Gary Becker and George Stigler, two Chicagoans, published Law Enforcement, Malfeasance, and Compensation of Enforcers in the Journal of Legal Studies, and they argued for incentive pay for law enforcers. Their ideas went where most academic ideas do, precisely nowhere. This may have had something to do with the fact that at the time, CEOs were still paid like bureaucrats, so the idea of paying bureaucrats with high-powered incentives must have sounded radical indeed. But the idea has come perhaps to its final time to be deployed. In the UK, as I mentioned before, they've just done this, and the data, while mixed and preliminary, is encouraging. The problem in the UK was that the National Health Service was facing high costs and bad results. The government wanted to improve performance, so in 2004, it introduced a plan to pay doctors for performance. It linked up the pay of family practitioners to performance on 76 clinical quality indicators and 70 indicators related to organization of care and patient experience. Of the clinical indicators, 10 related to maintaining disease registers, 56 to processes of care, such as measuring things or giving treatments, and 10 to intermediate outcomes, such as controlling blood pressure. Indicators were periodically reviewed and could be adjusted or dropped, with new indicators being introduced. A maximum of 1,000 points were available, equating to $50,000 per physician. The pay algorithm included both inputs and outputs. For example, it credited doctors for each blood pressure they recorded, as well as scaled points based on achieving blood pressure targets in patients. The same approach was used in a range of areas such as cholesterol. The results have been modestly successful. Work by Tim Duran and others shows performance on most metrics improved dramatically, especially in the first few years. Health outcomes improved way more than expected based on extrapolations from the past. In addition, the biggest changes were seen in the practices with the largest pre-programmed differences among patients. In other words, patient health and the equality of patient health both increased more than the government predicted prior to the adoption of the program. A report from the government concluded, our results suggest the financial incentive schemes have the potential to make a substantial contribution to the reduction of inequalities in the delivery of clinical care related to area deprivation. This does not mean pay for performance for doctors is a panacea or without problems. The ambulance cooing example is a good one. Consistent with the effort substitution concern noted above, there was some evidence doctors devoted more attention to incentivized activities rather than non-incentivized ones. This is the Holmstrom and Milgram point. Quality for non-incentivized activities associated with two conditions, asthma and coronary artery disease, deteriorated in the first 2 years of the program. But for other non-incentivized activities, like diabetes, it improved. And for other ones, like osteoporosis, it neither improved nor deteriorated. Overall, the program is a fairly ringing endorsement of pay for performance. We could imagine paying through Medicare in a similar way. Doctors today in the US have incentives, but they are opaque and not obviously linked with desired outcomes. Medicare reimburses by procedure, which means we get a lot of procedures. If we thought about paying for health, which is the performance we want, outcomes might be dramatically better. Or maybe not. I think we should at least experiment given the obvious problems with our current incentive scheme. But, as noted above, the Legal Academy has produced many thousands of articles, mostly criticizing CEO pay. And in this environment where market forces are at work, where they're absent and real value could be delivered by having smart people think through the issue, there's next to no work. Bureaucrats are another area where these ideas could be extended, and this is what I mentioned, the work I did with Fred Tung. Regulatory failures during the financial crisis resulted, at least in part, from a lack of sufficient incentives for bank examiners to act aggressively to prevent excessive risk-taking by banks. Bank regulators are not paid for performance. They're civil servants paid a fixed salary that does not depend on whether their actions improve banks' performance, protect banks from failure, or do anything with respect to social welfare. Trying to curb risk-taking at a bank may be personally very costly for a bank regulator. Without a large upside than what civil service compensation offers, regulators too often do the rational thing and play it safe. To create better incentives, we propose that regulators, specifically bank examiners, be compensated in part with periodic bonuses tied to the value of bank debt and equity, as well as a separate bonus linked to the timing of shutting down a failing bank. The need for high-powered incentives is clear from post-mortem bank reports. I read about 50 of these, this is what law professors do for fun, and was shocked to learn that at scores of banks, examiners were well aware of the operational deficiencies and excessive risk-taking years before banks failed. But regulators, who had the power to stop and change this, stood still in the face of this information. Washington Mutual, the largest bank failure in history at the time, enjoyed a fundamentally sound rating until 6 days before its collapse. This regulatory failure was not the result of insufficient information or attention on the part of regulators. In the 3 years before WAMU's collapse, examiners spent 100,000 hours and 400 days inspecting its assets and operations. And in report after report, they delineated precisely the problems that would eventually lead to its demise. The WAMU example is hardly unique. I was reading the New Yorker last night. In a just-released memo, confidential memo from Larry Summers, the president's chief economic advisor to President Obama, he said, quote, "A significant cause of the current crisis lies in the failure of regulators to exercise vigorously the authority they already have." In other words, the regulators devoted all their effort to diagnosis and none to cure. The reason? They weren't paid for cure, they were paid for diagnosis. The workers defined their work to fit within the incentive scheme that they were in. For bank examiners, if they define their work as filling out reports accurately and completely, then they did a great job. The examiner's reports, and I've read them, are fine work product. And if they weren't, then the examiners might suffer reputational or work-related losses. But if a report is well done and a bank fails, there are others that can be blamed. Before you walked in here, if I'd asked all of you who was responsible for the financial crisis, depending on your views, what economists call your priors, the answers might be George Bush, Bill Clinton, Barney Frank. It might be Wall Street CEOs or US housing policy or Fannie Mae. It might be government or capitalism. But if I asked you, I don't think anybody would have said bank examiners. So the risk of not acting is small, but the cost may be high. Most obviously, trying to change practices at a bank like WAMU or Citibank is likely to take a lot of effort, induce a great deal of stress, and bring heavy political pressure to bear on the examiner. In addition, examiners may reasonably fear the harm to society that would flow from making a type 1 error, that is, shutting down a bank that's actually sound. Giving bank examiners a stake in bank performance, both upside and downside, will improve incentives to act in the public interest. We don't discount the importance of public spiritedness as a motivation, but I think the financial crisis shows, as Larry Summers said, it clearly was not enough. As noted above, the key issue in implementing pay-for-performance is the ability to identify objective metrics of performance to be maximized. In contrast to most other types of bureaucratic functions, with banking regulation, we have such objective metrics. With the right mix of banks' debt and equity, public trading prices for these securities will serve this purpose. Bank stock prices reflect the social gains from lending. Bank debt prices reflect the market's best guess about the riskiness of bank lending practices. Adding or subtracting examiner pay based on bank capital costs incentivizes regulators towards striking a socially optimal balance between increasing bank credit and reducing the cost of bank failure. This could be more or less regulation depending on the bank and the circumstances. For instance, examiners with pay linked to bank debt might pursue a more interventionist approach in some cases, since they bear some of the losses arising from socially inefficient risks that exist on their watch. Regulators incentivized to worry about taxpayer losses may be more diligent in supervision of bank assets and management. They may be more aggressive in ensuring that corrective recommendations are implemented, and they may encourage or require changes to bank balance sheets and so on. Similarly, examiners who gain from increases in bank values may take steps to make the examination process more efficient, to get the right amount and type of disclosures, and to encourage valuable lending and risk-taking. While we would not presume to think we could figure out this optimal mix and leave it to agency heads to develop optimal compensation practices, we think the time has come for thinking about expanding pay performance, especially because Dodd-Frank, who say on pay provision may result in even higher powered incentives for CEOs, may mean we have a lot more accelerator, and so we need someone well incentivized manning the brake. As mentioned earlier, a significant problem with our proposal is the Hayekian one. We cannot know the optimal contract by logic. It will only come from experience. Unknowns include the right mix of debt and equity, whether to pay real or phantom shares, how long the holding or vesting requirement should be, and so on. The answers to these questions are likely something that requires a lot of experimentation and testing, especially in light of the potential negative impacts a bad pay performance system can have. We saw this with the hundreds of people who died in the UK in queued up ambulances. But there's only one or at most a few bank regulators, and unless the proposal is adopted across other areas of government, not that many agencies in which to experiment. Of course, this problem is not unique to regulator pay. It is the nature of government. So regulator incentive pay does not have the same market corrective that executive pay does, but I'm not sure that's the right comparison. Our proposal only has to be potentially better than current regulatory pay practices, not analogous to executive pay practices. And the experience in the UK, on the other dimension, suggests analysis could and would be done by people within the government and expert observers. We could also imagine a structure for internal competition within an agency. Suppose, for example, that regulatory responsibilities were divided by geography or industry or something else, and each division head was instructed to experiment with incentive pay for examiners, perhaps with within some set range. Division heads might be eligible for bonuses based on division performance in order to induce them to experiment and learn. So we might need some supplemental institutions within government to enhance the plausibility of incentive pay, but I don't think this makes it unworkable. If we're right that this is a way to motivate government employees, be they teachers, doctors, or bank examiners, there's lots of other places we could imagine expanding it. For instance, the delay of FDA scientists in approving drugs for market is well known, and yet the solutions offered are mundane and don't seem to have done much. The problem is, again, the Basquiat one between the seen and the unseen. Patients who suffer harm or die from approved drugs are seen. They generate negative pressure on the approval process. Whereas the many more who might be helped earlier by early approval are the unseen. They're more numerous, but they're less politically salient, and the harms from delay are muddled with other factors. The losses can be attributed to other things beyond speculative claims about unapproved drugs. If this is right and FDA scientists have incentives that skew from the optimal, perhaps we could extend the paper performance to recalibrate their incentives to optimize social welfare. As a first step, we could give them financial gain linked to drug company profits. This would give them the incentives to move drugs more efficiently and effectively through the process. One might object that this would have incentives to please drug companies at the expense of patients. But this assumes the stock price is a really bad measure of the social value of the activity in question. Over the short run, this surely might be the case, but over the long run, this is a much harder claim to make. If a company sells a drug that kills patients, it will not be able to maintain its value or maybe even survive. So one move would simply be to extend the holding period. We could have scientists hold a portfolio of stocks for a long period of time, say 10 years. Of course, the longer the vesting requirement, the lower powered the incentives, and the greater chance of delinking between pay for performance. This problem is the same for CEO stock options, by the way. Another move then, especially recognizing the need for regulators to provide a bit of break to firm ambitions, is to have part of the pay be explicitly linked to downsides tied to patient harm, be they through the tort system or otherwise. Just as Tung and I propose bank examiners have a security that have part of their pay track bank debt, so too here we could imagine a pay algorithm that features similar components designed to strike the right balance between encouraging drugs and protecting patients. Other applications of pay performance could include safety inspectors, patent examiners, and even judges. I don't think it's hard to imagine trying to calculate the algorithm that tracks the social welfare of the choices of these actors and then trying to fit some part of it into pay. So let's think about how pay might work in one of these cases. Judges sentence individuals to jail based on an assessment about the costs and benefits of incarceration, tailored to the facts of the individual case. How likely is this person will commit another crime? What is the cost of keeping them in prison? How do we value their liberty? What's the signal to be other criminals, and so forth? We might believe judges optimize this, But if we could develop metrics that force them to process the information they receive more efficiently, that is, to bear the cost of their decisions more directly, this might be a good thing. Right now, we rely on judicial wisdom, but prisons are filling up and the costs of judicial decisions are borne by others. Why not try to bring this cost-benefit calculation to bear? I don't know what this algorithm would look like. Some debit for from a bonus for every day someone sentenced to jail to reflect the social cost. A credit for every day someone doesn't commit another crime to reflect the social gain. A debit for crimes committed in the future to reflect the social cost, and so forth. Or whether it would work in practice, but I think it's worth thinking about. We could think about, back to my pay, designing the optimal system for rewarding law professors, tied to US News rankings, or the cost of going to law school, or the income of our graduates, but maybe the stakes are too low for us to care much. I doubt the marginal value of a law review article produced by the average faculty member at the 40th ranked law school is very high, and risking revolt among faculty for changing pay might not be worth it. If faculty scholarship or teaching really matter all that much, one would expect lower ranked schools to innovate to try to climb the ladder, assuming this was their goal. But law schools don't have property rights in their pay for performance innovations, especially public schools, and especially with how quickly secrets get out these days. So any innovation could bring high risks, but with low rewards, since others, especially peer or slightly higher ranked schools, could just adopt schemes that work. I've gone on way too long, so let me just offer a quick conclusion. Pay per performance, where it is used today in public companies, is under sustained attack by academia. The attacks are largely based on theories about behavior that can be tested empirically. So far, while the criticisms, including some of my own work on insider trading, have shown how these contracts might be improved on the margin, the case against pay performance has not been made in my view. Moreover, my remarks can be read as a call to divert some of the energy of the academy and others to focus less on CEOs and more on the enormous amount of slack and misdirected incentives that exist in the rest of the economy and government. We should be expanding pay for performance through experimentation and testing in places ranging from the classroom to the courthouse. When we do so, we should be mindful of one-size-fits-all solutions, and therefore we should try to utilize market or market-like processes to figure out the best approach to paying workers for performance. Thank you. I'm here to take your questions. Seeing none, we'll retire for canapes. Yes, please, Mr. Carell.
And this may be a very tall order, but if you had to get the faculty of the Yale Law School to be as productive as the faculty of the Chicago Law School, what would you do to make that happen?
I have no idea, which is probably why I'm not the dean. Mike, do you want to take this one? I don't know. I'm humble about how much I could possibly add to that conversation. I haven't looked at the matter closely. There's obviously a big issue with respect to the different way that work falls on individuals. So you could give me enormous incentives, and I don't think I would be as productive as our most productive faculty member. In fact, I'm highly confident of that. So when we're talking about at that level, I'm not sure. I think a lot of work would have to be done. I think there should be some experimentation, but I think there's a good reason why we don't see that experimentation.
Can I conclude that there's no possible way to get those slackers to be more productive? Is that what you're saying?
It's possible. It's possible. And so we should, when we look and see pay arrangements, I think this is the point I was making about being humble, we should think that unless there's something that shows that there's a strong reason why we're in a bad equilibrium, we should take the fact that people don't use pay per performance as evidence. Maybe it's not well designed, or maybe it wouldn't fit there. I look at a lot of areas like law faculties or bank examiners or FDA scientists and think there are reasons why the choices don't reflect the social optimum. They reflect something about labor unions or faculty power or something like that. The point I made about you don't have any sort of intellectual property in the pay that you come up with. And so there may be things, that external things that force this. CEOs weren't paid performance until the mid-1990s. It's just remarkable. But I think, if I were a George Mason, I would do it. If I was the dean of George Mason, I would be experimenting and trying to get better performance, whether that would be scholarship or whether that be better teaching or something else. I'm not sure. Yes, please.
To the extent that limited as insured is, firms are beginning to shift their responsibility away from just shareholders towards stakeholders. Have there been any initiatives in terms of pay for performance where pay is linked to these new kinds of performance indicators? And if not, do you ever see it happening?
Okay, so the question was whether or not whether any companies are moving towards a model where CEO pay is tied to stakeholder performance or something like that. I haven't seen that. I know companies now have to make pretty extensive, in the US at least, they have to make fairly extensive environmental disclosures. This is sort of a new trend. That's one large class of stakeholders. The real value of using the stock price is it is a highly salient, highly responsive thing to the people who are standing to lose or make the next dollar from a CEO decision. And we generally rely on other things, other forces, legal and non-legal, to constrain the ability of companies, their CEOs, to impose externalities on stakeholders. So workers, they're protected by labor rules. The environment is protected by tort law and environmental rules. So, and those people, if they can't contract with the firm to keep the firm from acting badly, like creditors or suppliers or workers can contract with the firm, so we think you can just protect yourself. If they can't contract, then the government steps in. That's the tort law. That's environmental law to solve those kinds of collective action problems. So the danger of bringing in the kind of stakeholder tie to pay is if you're the CEO and I say, maximize for the stakeholders of General Electric, and I tell you now, go do your job as the CEO of General Electric, what in the heck would you do? How would you balance the interests of the butterflies and the workers and the customers and the suppliers? It would be a completely muddled and hopeless task. So the cleaner thing, I think, is to say, let's try to make sure that the stock price, using these other forces of law and otherwise, is the best metric for the value of the company, and then give you one thing. So if I'm the CEO, I know my job every day to wake up and create shareholder value, and shareholder value brings in these other things in the ways I've described. Please.
So you mentioned that CEOs, like, there's a lot of concentration on the high pay that they have and how it's like necessary for companies to maintain their CEOs to pay them a lot. But why can't there still be a pay for performance and have that competitive edge, but have still the cap on the amount that you can be paid as a CEO? Because you're still getting incentive to do your job well because you want to reach that height, that cap. But there should be a cap at. So there's not like this like extraordinary divergence in what you're being paid based on your job.
Great. So that's a great question. The question was, if we're talking about incentives, incentives exist on the margin, and why does the margin have to be between $10 million and $11 million? Why can't it be between $1 million and $2 million? In other words, why not bring the absolute level of pay down and still have the same amount of incentives? Yes? And even more so, your point could be taken as because of the diminishing marginal utility of money, going from $1 million to $2 million is a way bigger deal than going from 10 to 11. Yes, okay. Great point. So I don't really have a dog in that fight. As someone who doesn't make $10 million a year, I guess I'd be okay if we could figure out a way to get from here to there. And I guess that's the question. In prior periods, the way we did that was taxes, right? So we could tax very highly CEO pay, as well as everybody else I mentioned, Tom Cruise and so forth. And then we could have a huge debate about the incentive effects of taxation. Globalization of assets makes this a little bit more complicated, because if the US tries to do that, we don't exactly have a complete monopoly on where CEOs incorporated. Aon, for example, a Chicago-based outfit, is now thinking about moving, or maybe has moved, to London. It's not impossible to imagine or think that might be a good thing. I'd want to know what it is about the high pay that is necessarily a bad thing. And then if we agreed as a political entity that it is a bad thing, how exactly we could implement it without working some bigger disruption. Some people have talked about why it's a bad thing. Bob Frank at Cornell is a person who's made a lot of arguments. He writes a piece in the New York Times. His big thing is envy, right? I can't sleep at night knowing that Mark Zuckerberg is worth $5 billion. That's his argument, that his wealth imposes a negative externality on me. I don't subscribe to that view. I don't think wealth is pizza. I think the more you have, and it doesn't take away from me. We're not dividing up a pie here. Facebook being invented and Mark Zuckerberg making billions of dollars has not made me worse off. Actually, it has made me worse off because I hate Facebook and really don't like being around people who use it, but it's been a net social welfare, and the gains have also increased income inequality. So, assuming that reducing income inequality was a good thing, then I just think the other response would be, well, I'm not sure exactly how to get there. But theoretically, I completely agree with your point.
Do you see a potential for kind of destructive competition? So some law firms pay partners, UChicago, and you get like your profit share is determined very closely to the business you bring into the firm. Others don't, because there's a sense that can lead to infighting, right? So if you have a certain bonus pool for bank regulators, and it's going to be paid out, and each regulator or each team who shuts down a bank, there's an incentive there to maybe in the really strong sense to prevent other regulators from getting there first, or there's like a race to it, which could be a good thing, right? But it could also be negative if it leads to sabotage or the inability to communicate across institutions or
Great question. So the question is, another problem with incentive pay is that it could have a bad effect on teamwork. So if teamwork is really important, maybe incentive pay works some disadvantage. So the first thing we want to do if we were thinking about this is say, well, how much teamwork is necessarily happening? So that's one thing. In the bank examiner context, across banks, I'm not sure. I don't think much. In fact, I think we should take the idea that Fred and I have and extend it even a further step, a very Coasean step. Once we have a pay-for-performance culture among bank examiners, I think we should auction off the right to examine a particular bank to bank examiners and let them compete with each other in a way that their bidding would reflect their judgment both of their own capability, maybe some information they have about the bank, maybe a bank examiner who's been at a bank for too long and has become beholden, right? Stockholm syndrome or the revolving door problem, however you want to describe it, and someone else can see that, well, they can outbid that examiner for that bank. So I would even go a step further, but I think your teamwork point is a really good one. So we'd want to think about it. If I was the CEO of a company, if I was the dean of the law school, I would, before implementing pay-for-performance, I would say, okay, how important is teamwork? Here at the law school, I'm not sure it's very important, right? Even places where teamwork is really important, like the Chicago Bulls, they have really big incentive contracts. So we'd want to think carefully about it. Maybe the fact that my colleague is paid a lot more would have this envy effect that Bob Frank has talked about, or make me feel bad. And there may be something to that. We at the law school don't know how much each other make, and this is actually a really, I think, or one reason I think that's the case. One reason could be teamwork. Another reason could be avoiding these kinds of jealousies. I think another reason, and a powerful one, is it lowers the cost of maintaining key faculty members. Because if someone threatened to leave because of a higher salary and the dean has to pay them off to stay, and everybody knows about that, then each of us will be clamoring for a little bit, well, I want some to stay. And that just makes the cost of keeping someone higher, because instead of paying them $100 to not leave, you're now going to pay them $100 and Henderson $5 and this guy $5 and that guy $5, which just means the total cost of keeping them maybe $200. But if I don't know that my colleagues who are more desirable to other schools than me got the $100, I'm better off, because I would agree to that bargain ex ante because I want to keep them around. But the teamwork is a great point. Yes, please.
You talked in part about, you mentioned briefly tying something like FDA regulator pay to profits of drug companies. Insofar as shareholders already have an incentive to have their profits maximized, what's new about what does the FDA add to the equation then? If the market handles it fine.
Okay, good. So the question is, if the CEO's already paid, if the CEO of Bristol Myers Squibb is already paid in stock, what does paying the FDA examiner do? So a disclaimer, and that is this idea, let's call it that, was conceived of and composed sitting at Z&H this morning at about 10:30. So based on that, let me say that I think it's analogous to bank examiners in the sense that, but it's exactly the opposite problem, right? The bank examiners were not aggressive enough. And the reason they weren't aggressive enough is because if there was a failure, you don't blame bank examiners, right? It's Bush or Clinton or Barney Frank or whatever, whoever. But if they have to act to shut something down, enormous costs. For FDA scientists, it's exactly the opposite, right? The cost of them approving drugs early to get drugs to market, if it results in somebody taking the drug and dying, really bad for the examiner, lots of pressure on the FDA. So as a consequence, knowing that you bear more of the cost of the downside, FDA scientists will drag their feet. They will dot every I, cross every T, make sure the thing is completely safe. And so they'll just err on the margin of more delay. And the process is painfully slow. And patients who have really bad diseases, who want drugs to come to market or off-label uses or all kinds of things that the FDA regulates, they go and they pound the table and they say to the FDA, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And the FDA examiner's process, I think it's now like 7 years to get a drug approved and billions of dollars. So I'm just saying, if we give them incentives to optimize that process, it might be that, we give them incentives, stock, and they get deducted their bonus if people die or tort judgments or whatever it is. Maybe 7 years is the optimal. I have no idea, but I'm not confident given the current incentives. That is, FDA scientists, we pay you $100,000 a year, and your promotion is in no way tied to whether or not you get this calculation about optimizing how drugs come to market right. Please.
What about the number of bureaucrats involved in the process itself? I mean, CEO can receive a huge payment because their number are small. But if there are a lot of bureaucrats and you want to increase their payment using this kind of scheme, wouldn't that increase the cost?
Good. So a couple responses. The question is, there's only 5,000 CEOs. There's a lot more government workers than that, sadly. Won't that increase the costs? Won't this just sort of, we're in an era of huge government deficits. Important things like funding for science and things are being cut, early child, whatever. This is just going to make the problem worse. Okay, first, as a factual matter, between 2006 and 2005 and 2008, before the financial crisis, the 3 bank-regulated agencies gave out $60 million in bonuses to 2,000 bank examiners. Hey, pay for performance. Problem is, although I looked as diligently as I possibly could, I can't figure out to whom they gave them, why, what the amounts were, or what the metrics were. Completely not transparent. And my guess is the bonuses were tied to not regulating very much, because that was the sort of culture of the time. High-flying banks, and we'll give you performances for like really well-done reports, the diagnosis and not the cure. So the government is already using performance pay, but in a really bad way. Other countries, Singapore, something nearby to your home country, they have deployed very high pay for bureaucrats. The CEO, the president of Singapore, Freudian slip. The president of Singapore and lots of the big cabinet ministers make millions of dollars a year, because they think, to get good people, you got to pay a lot of money. We sort of rely on deferred payment, right? You can go and be the attorney general and make $130,000 a year, and then you can go to a law firm and make $3.3 million, and maybe it's better, right, to pay them, and maybe that's right if it's tied to performance. With respect to the pay in my bank examiner model, if you're paying with stock and debt, it's very easy for the government to offset that cost by engaging in securities transactions in the market that perfectly offset the expected payments that would have to be made. So I think if the government was smart about it, they could use derivative contracts that make the net cost of paying examiners with stock 0. Okay, maybe one more? Yes? Mr. Joseph.
One of the most amazing things in the last 10 years has been the ability of crowdsourcing to effectively not only police work product, but also create work product. So with Wikipedia, you have not just excellent crowdsourced corrections, but you also have crowdsourced creation. So one question is, we have sort of a crowdsourcing mechanism in the law, and that is key tam lawsuits, class actions, that sort of thing. Is there any ex-ante structure that we could use, for instance, where the FDA subcontracts to double-blind testing, and there's pay performance associated not with the performance of the testing, but not with the drug performance, but with the replicability of the testing as between two agencies, for instance? Is there some way the law can engineer that sort of ability to harness the information flows that exist now?
First, I should note the three people here in the front are alumni and friends who flew back specifically for this talk. They should be commended for that, because I'm not sure they got what they paid for. But I'm delighted they were here, and this is a really great question. And I started with this sort of joke about the State of the Union, that the state of the Coase theorem is strong. The state of Coase is strong, because this is a very Coasean point too. Say, Henderson, why have you delineated the boundaries of the regulator around the existing regulatory agency? My answer to the teamwork question was, well, hey, let's throw that open, and accepting that we define the regulator as the FDIC, let's have competition within the FDIC for bank examiners to examine particular banks. And this model is, hey, why not just have anybody do it, right? We could imagine a model where anybody bid to be an examiner of a bank, and as long as your incentives were set up right and you could bear the cost, and maybe you were able to bond that you would be able to bear those costs, then why not? We're in the science fiction world here a little bit, but I think it's worth thinking about. More conservatively, just the idea that there would be sort of a crowdsourced examination of banks. Not only that investors would be making sort of Keynesian beauty contest judgments about what other people thought about, but also that sort of diligent people, we know people spend hours for no reason writing Amazon reviews or doing all kinds of things. Like, there are weird people out there, and or maybe people with strange utility curves, in Chicago speak. So why not harness that? This is a great idea. It's even more perverse than that, in that bank examiner evaluations are, they're like the atomic bomb secrets. They're just not revealed at all. So we have this system where examiners are not motivated for performance, ex ante, and then ex post, we have no ability to go back and look at their results and except, as filtered through these inspector general reports, and say, hey, you did a really bad job. So the reputation thing that I talked about, which could be powerful for me, we don't even really deploy it, because we don't haul these examiners up and say, shame on you, you didn't do a good job. You should have stood up within your existing thing. So there's also a part of that, which is we could just reveal this information and have sort of a crowdsourcing of the ex post sort of post-mortems as a way of enforcing reputation as well. Thank you for your questions.